After the man turned around, he awakened the magic of production, turning the management of the territory into a tower defense game. A barren village in his hands would soon be transformed into the strongest fortress. As the youngest son of the marquis, he had shown extraordinary intelligence since the age of 2, and being very cute, the maids loved to gather around him to serve.
However, the male protagonist clearly understands that within books lies beauty, and in any world one must first study diligently to survive. But unexpectedly, enduring hardship only leads to more hardship. After the butler learned that the protagonist was eager to learn, he took the initiative to test him, and discovered that the protagonist was indeed very talented. He then chose to personally supervise the protagonist's studies, which reminded the protagonist of the fear once dominated by advanced mathematics. In addition to studying, the protagonist also practiced swordsmanship with his personal maid, Tia.
However, since his body hasn't fully developed, it's more like playing around with Tia rather than practicing swordsmanship. Although the older maids think playing around with the young master is disrespectful, the protagonist doesn't mind. He just gives Tia a symbolic punishment, leaving others with nothing to say, and that's the end of it. The male protagonist, after all, has the soul of an adult, and had studied martial arts for a long time in his previous life. By the time he was 5 years old, there were no children in the marquis' residence who could spar with him. Unfortunately, before he could advance further, due to his exceptional talent in swordsmanship, the deputy captain of the knights in the marquis' residence volunteered to train him rigorously every day. Moreover, to not waste this talent, even during rest time, the protagonist is not allowed to relax and is required to replace it with horse stance exercises. However, the protagonist gradually notices that as his reputation as a genius spreads, his second and third brothers look at him more and more strangely, clearly seeing him as a competitor for their heir position. He didn't want to die suddenly for no reason, so he decided to play the role of a lazy spendthrift until adulthood. Since he was a spendthrift, he had to spend money lavishly, so the protagonist went to the largest money-squandering place in the area, the Merry Chamber of Commerce. But as soon as he entered, he saw an old man leading his own son, preparing to sell him as a slave for money. Just as he sighed about the hardships of the old society, a receptionist quickly approached. After all, the young master of the marquis' house was a super VIP customer. The protagonist asked how much the boy was worth, and the receptionist, after evaluating, gave a fair price of 3 silver coins. The old man immediately became furious, cursing the boy as a money loser, saying he couldn't even fetch a good price as a slave. The male protagonist immediately offered 5 silver coins, which could both save a life and build his spendthrift persona. The old man took the money and left without any reluctance for his own son. The receptionist eagerly facilitated the contract between the male protagonist and the boy. As a dazzling light flashed, a slave mark appeared on the boy's hand, meaning that unless the protagonist actively released him, the boy would be the protagonist's slave for life. As a modern person, the protagonist was somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of owning a slave, but the boy was very grateful to the protagonist, believing that he had saved his life. Therefore, the slave brand that slaves usually hide is, in his eyes, a symbol of his bond with the protagonist. Moreover, he listens to no one but the protagonist's orders. The deputy leader, whom the protagonist avoids, he dares to confront without hesitation. Unexpectedly, this courage earns the deputy leader's admiration, who suggests that since the protagonist is shirking training, this boy named Kamsin should replace him. In the blink of an eye, the protagonist turned 8, reaching the age to officially determine his magic attribute. Unexpectedly, not to mention the marquis family's inherited fire attribute, the protagonist had none of the 4 major elemental attributes at all, only awakening the universally acknowledged useless production magic. In this world, nobles revere the 4 major attributes, so the protagonist's existence had become a disgrace to the marquis household, a waste that must be completely erased. Seeing this, the elder brother immediately shielded the protagonist behind him and persuaded the marquis to make use of the waste by sending the protagonist to a village bordering the enemy country as a lord. If the protagonist could develop it, it would be a pleasant surprise. If he couldn't withstand it and died, it would also be a good excuse to take the initiative. The marquis thought this made sense, so he allocated a village to the protagonist, and then, unwilling to stay a second longer, left the protagonist's side with the second and third brothers in disgust. The eldest brother felt very guilty towards the protagonist, but he really had no other way to protect him. Naturally, the protagonist did not blame the eldest brother after all. If it weren't for him, he would probably be done for by now. The servants were all indignant about the protagonist's situation, but the protagonist felt quite excited about it. Rather than scheming and living precariously in the marquis's mansion, managing his own territory would be much more carefree. Although the protagonist was considered exiled, the vice-captain and the butler had long regarded him as their successor. Therefore, they both resigned from the marquis' residence, choosing to continue following the protagonist and assist him in establishing a new foundation. However, upon arriving at the fief, they unexpectedly encountered a bandit attack. The deputy leader Dai first expressed that they should just do it, but the adventurers were unwilling to get involved in this mess. Their commission was only to escort the protagonist, not to defend the territory, and currently they were outnumbered, so fighting would be a death sentence. Just as everyone was in a deadlock, the protagonist decisively decided to act as bait himself. After all, a lord who cannot protect his subjects has no right to demand protection from others. Unlike other arrogant nobles, the male lead treated all the adventurers equally along the way, even able to call each adventurer by name. This speech changed their attitude, and they decided to take a gamble for the male lead. After all, it was the first time they had seen a noble willing to lead by example, rather than treating adventurers as expendable. Butler Espada first launched earth magic on the ground according to the plan, instantly erecting 2 high earthen walls. Then, everyone used the walls as cover to launch a long-range sneak attack on the rear of the bandits, catching them off guard right from the start. When the bandits realized and turned to attack in the direction of the walls, Dai Yi led a charge on the enemy's right flank. With just one person, he caused chaos, overturning people and horses and disrupting the formation. Adventurer Alt was not to be outdone, simultaneously launching an assault on the enemy's left flank, achieving results no less impressive than Dai Yi. Seeing his subordinates in disarray and powerless to fight back, the bandit leader decisively charged towards the direction of the earth wall, aiming directly at the rear support long-range troops. But the protagonist had already anticipated this move and rushed forward, delivering a heavy blow to the leader with a sword. Kamsin seamlessly followed up, delivering another strike to completely kill the leader. With the bandit leader dead, the remaining bandits became a disorganized mob and were quickly captured. In theory, the escort job was over, and the adventurers should have taken their payment and left, but Old had a different idea. He believed the protagonist was brave and wise, without the typical arrogance of nobility, and would surely achieve great things in the future. So, he persuaded his companions to stay and help the protagonist build the territory, to witness what achievements he could attain. When they entered the village, they were met with a scene of devastation. They were almost too poor to put food on the table. The village chief immediately began to complain, stating that the village borders the empire and has been plagued by bandit attacks for years. Coupled with extreme poverty, it feels completely abandoned by the empire. The male protagonist had already done his research before coming and was well aware of the village's difficulties. However, given the current situation, complaining is futile. Only development is the real solution. However, no matter how many nice words are said, they are useless. Therefore, the male lead immediately reduced the originally high tax rate of 30% down to 10%. Then he ordered Espada to use earth magic to build a high earthen wall around the village. The male protagonist, along with Kamusen, chopped a large amount of wood, and then used the universally acknowledged weakest production magic to instantly create a block of fiber infused with nanofiber technology. Wood was dumbfounded upon seeing this, not understanding what the male protagonist was doing. After picking it up, he found that although the fiber block was lightweight, it seemed exceptionally sturdy, so he decided to personally test its strength. Unexpectedly, even using enough force to split a rock did not cause any damage to this incredibly light block. Production magic is considered the weakest because even with a large consumption of magic power, it is difficult to produce even a single item. However, this point was completely ineffective on the protagonist, as his magic seemed endless. Clearly, a wooden fiber block in his hands could be transformed into a katana with a metallic texture. Seeing Camerson watching enviously from the side, the protagonist casually gave him the sword. The protagonist wonders if Dyer doesn't like axe spears. Tia naturally wouldn't say that, but seeing her expression, the protagonist decided to make some jewelry to compensate her in the future. Seeing that the village was so poor, it didn't even have a place for him to stay, the protagonist prepared the fiber blocks, ready to build a mansion by himself. Since he had never built such a large structure before, he initially approached it with a trial and error mindset. However, as he started with the load-bearing pillars, the protagonist gradually conceived the details of the mansion, becoming more adept at the process of constructing it. Gradually, from the floor to the walls, from the stairs to the roof, all the details were generated according to his design, and in no time, an enormous mansion was completed. The man turned managing the territory into a tower defense game. The originally barren small village was not only surrounded by a tall concrete wall he created, but also had battlements and watchtowers reserved, densely packed with hundreds of ballistae, all generated by him using the universally acknowledged useless production magic in just one day. The deputy leader Dai was stunned, thinking that the marquis who was obsessed with the 4-element magic was too foolish. If someone had the protagonist's terrifying development speed, who would still compete in single combat like those mages? Before constructing the fortifications, the protagonist actually first focused on improving the people's livelihood. After all, he had already created a big mansion for himself using production magic, so it wouldn't be appropriate to let the villagers continue living in those small shabby houses. So he personally renovated all the houses in the village, and taking inspiration from modern grid planning, arranged all the houses neatly, making future expansion more convenient. Of course, the protagonist didn't forget to take some time to create a large bathhouse. After all, having built houses for several days, shouldn't he enjoy himself a little? However, what the protagonist didn't expect was that the young daughter of the neighboring count's family and the viscount responsible for escorting her were on their way, meaning his enjoyable days were still ahead. After waking up, the protagonist continued with important tasks, namely solving the village's water source problem. With the earth magic of the steward Espada, a long canal could be dug in an instant. Dai and his subordinates followed behind, attending to the corners that fine-tuning magic couldn't reach. Finally, the protagonist used production magic to reinforce and strengthen the ground and walls. In less than a day, a canal connecting to the lake was completed. As the protagonist announced the opening of the sluice, clear lake water instantly surged into the canal. However, the protagonist did not become complacent because of this. Instead, he first considered the issue of rising water levels during the rainy season, and thus created a reservoir outside the village. The villagers were immensely grateful to the protagonist. Once the basic survival issues were resolved, the protagonist began to consider the problem of making money. The batch of weapons he previously produced is a good choice. Although the materials used are just ordinary wood, with a light swipe, the adventurer's sturdy shields instantly split in two. Selling them would definitely make money. However, the development of the territory cannot always rely on the protagonist alone. The villagers also need a self-sufficient livelihood. Therefore, the protagonist wants to find some ways for them to participate as well. Just then, Ort brought back a cart of ores, which included not only copper and iron, but also some gold, silver, and even a bit of mithril ore. The protagonist, excited by the sight, eagerly used production magic and quickly created an iron ingot. To compensate Kusala for the damaged shield, the protagonist agreed to create two swords for him, one short and one long. Since it was the first time using metal to perform production magic, the protagonist carefully sensed the difference between metal and wood, meticulously visualizing each part of the short sword in his mind, and quickly crafted a very exquisite short sword. Then, using the same method, he created a long sword with maximum style. Kusala was naturally very touched, while the other adventurers were jealous and all requested the protagonist to make weapons for them as well. For the protagonist, this was just a small effort, and he easily fulfilled their requests one by one. The butler looked at the mithril ore with some seriousness, believing that there shouldn't be such rich mineral deposits near the village. Otherwise, the exiled protagonist wouldn't have been allowed to take over. This can only mean that a new labyrinth has appeared nearby. It's important to know that any labyrinth is an inexhaustible treasure trove of resources, and once the protagonist's marquis father finds out, he will definitely send others to reap the benefits. Therefore, the protagonist decided not to explore for the time being, and to wait until he had managed the village so securely that no one could interfere. Just then, the villagers came to report that a large group of shell dragons was approaching the village. This is a life and death crisis for the villagers, but for the male protagonist, it's a great opportunity. He decisively orders the gates to be closed. His hundreds of ballistae are eager for action. With hundreds of ballistae firing simultaneously, the armored sub-dragons, impervious to swords and spears, are instantly pierced and harvested like wheat. The defending soldiers and civilians were encouraged and immediately launched a second round of volleys, quickly taking down more than a dozen sub-dragons. The problem was that iron swords hadn't been mass-produced yet, and they were about to run out, so the protagonist decisively ordered the switch to wooden swords, as the sharpness of his wooden swords was not much inferior to iron swords, and could still take down a sub-dragon with one strike. The villagers defending the city had never fought such an easy battle, with no need to bear the risk of close combat, just mechanically firing crossbow bolts continuously. The group of armored drakes, which could have easily flattened their small village, was utterly powerless under the barrage of firepower, and was wiped out completely in an instant. And in this epic disaster, not a single person in the village's military or civilian population was injured, and only a few hundred crossbow bolts were used. The shell-armored dragons are treasures all over, and everything except the internal organs can be exchanged for a large sum of money. The protagonist needed to mobilize the entire village, and it took a full 3 days to barely finish dismantling them. Unfortunately, the dragon meat doesn't store well, and will spoil completely in no time. Therefore, the protagonist generously rewarded all the military and civilians with the meat of the sub-dragons, encouraging them to eat as much as they could to avoid any waste. This single gesture won the hearts of the military and civilians, making them believe that following the protagonist would definitely lead to a promising future. The materials harvested from the sub-dragons this time are conservatively estimated to bring in profits exceeding gold coins. The problem is that for cases of large profits over 100 jin, 50% must be handed over to the protagonist's marquis father. So, the protagonist took the butler's suggestion and credited this hunt to his elder brother. This way, the elder brother received the credit, while the protagonist gained the actual benefits. Except for the marquis who got nothing, everyone got what they wanted, and their alliance was strengthened. Not long after, a caravan arrived and saw that a fortress had suddenly risen in what was once a poor and remote area. They immediately realized there was a big business opportunity, though they didn't expect it to be this significant, almost like stirring up a nest of armored drakes. However, they quickly reacted and hurriedly promised to gather all their manpower to ensure this deal would be made. The protagonist also gave them the remaining dragon meat, as it would be wasted otherwise, considering it a way to strengthen their relationship. The weapons provided by the protagonist were also extremely refined, which made the Bell brothers think of monopolizing. Naturally, the protagonist wouldn't let them have their way. Without comparing prices, how could they sell at a good price? However, the first major client naturally receives benefits. The protagonist is willing to help them set up a shop in the village, establishing a long-term trade relationship. The Bell brothers are, of course, very pleased, though they didn't expect the shop to be built overnight. As the village continues to develop, the expansion of the territory is imperative, with the minimum requirement being to accommodate 10,000 people, and the necessary facilities and personnel must also be arranged accordingly. The protagonist had already planned for this. He intended to manufacture gunpowder and use it on a large scale on the battlefield. With the new type of fortress becoming popular, it needed to be paired with a triangular bastion, so that no matter which direction the enemy attacked from, they would face crossfire from at least 3 points. Shortly after, the neighboring count's youngest daughter, Artie, and the Viscount Panamera escorting her arrived at the protagonist's territory. The two came this time to arrange a marriage with the male lead, as he has been known as a genius since childhood. The Count was unaware that the male lead had been exiled, and mistakenly thought this was a signal of the Marquis's intention to attack, so he chose to send his youngest daughter as a gesture of goodwill. The male lead repeatedly explained that this was not the case, but Panamera simply did not believe him. A once barren village has quickly built high walls, something that cannot be done with fewer than 5,000 people. Besides serving as a military stronghold, what else could it be for?
The main character knew that just talking was useless, so he decided to demonstrate personally. He started by having the butler generate a high earthen wall. Of course, such an earthen wall is not durable and would collapse without magical reinforcements. However, with the main character's reinforcement, it instantly transformed into a solid city wall. As for the city gate, it was the same. The wooden gate generated by the main character was even better than an ordinary iron gate. At this moment, Artie realized that the protagonist, like herself, had awakened to non-4 element magic. While she was still wallowing in self-pity for being abandoned by her family and sent for a marriage alliance, the protagonist had already built such a large enterprise using the widely regarded as useless production magic. Panamera originally planned to disrupt the marriage, regardless of whether the male lead was a genius or a fool. However, now he has changed his mind, believing that the male lead can definitely provide Artie with a stable life. Therefore, it all depends on whether the male lead and Artie are willing. Although Artie has developed some affection for the male lead, she still wants to get to know him better first. The protagonist didn't mind much. It was just about building another house and feeding 2 more mouths. Not much effort. Artie tentatively asked the protagonist's opinion on dolls, and unexpectedly, what her parents considered a distraction, the protagonist was quite interested in. This inadvertently opened Artie's heart, making her more eager to interact with the protagonist. Soon, a mermaid girl was brought in. The little one was initially a bit wary, but ultimately couldn't resist curiosity and took small bites of the food offered by the male lead. Upon discovering it was actually shell dragon meat, the next day, it brought the entire mermaid group along. The mermaids were uneasy yet somewhat expectant, finding it hard to believe that such a small child could hunt shell dragons. However, the Mermaid King immediately asked the protagonist if he wanted a wife, intending to betroth his daughter to him. The mermaid tribe originally tried to stay as far away from humans as possible, but recently their habitat was taken over by the shell dragon, causing many casualties among their kin. The Mermaid King now hopes to find a strong person to become his daughter Priora's husband, to protect the entire mermaid tribe. The male protagonist who can annihilate the group of shell dragons is undoubtedly that strong person. The male protagonist is expanding the village and is currently most in need of manpower, so he immediately states that he can protect the mermaid tribe. But marriage is not necessary. The male protagonist quickly built 2 surrounding houses, with interiors that are spacious and bright, for the mermaids to play and rest. As for the mermaids' return, it is naturally their expertise in underwater work. The protagonist had actually already built a sewer system, but underwater work is very inconvenient for humans. Now with the merfolk, the task of discharging wastewater has someone to take it on. However, this mutually beneficial arrangement still doesn't provide a sense of security for the merfolk, and they insist on making the protagonist their prince consort. Artie and the male protagonist have similar experiences. Both are the youngest children in their families, and both awakened non-4 element magic. Moreover, the puppet magic Artie awakened is considered heretical and forbidden by the nobility. Therefore, when the family needed to marry for survival, Artie was the first to be abandoned. However, the male protagonist awakened production magic, which in terms of practicality is actually inferior to puppet magic. The male lead, however, used this to build an impregnable territory, which naturally made Artie admire him. She originally wanted to slowly develop feelings with the male lead and talk about marriage when she grew up, but the appearance of Priora gave her a sense of urgency. She unexpectedly changed her usual shy demeanor and went boating on the lake with the male lead to strengthen their relationship. But the lake is the territory of the mermaids, and any disturbance cannot escape their notice, so they quickly found them. However, the children's commotion inadvertently helped Artie, causing her to accidentally fall into the male lead's arms. Priora was very jealous of this, and immediately stepped forward to show concern as a wife. The male lead tried to explain that they were not engaged, but this only made Priora angrier, thinking the male lead was a scoundrel who starts things, and then abandons them. The Mermaid King appeared and asked the male lead what he meant, as he already had his daughter, yet was still transferring his affections to another woman. In that case, there should be a competition to determine the winner. If the Mermaid King won, the male lead would have to formally agree to the engagement with Priora. The male lead hadn't replied yet, but the deputy leader agreed first. The butler also thought that resolving this matter early would allow him to focus on his studies, so both sides agreed on a best-of-3 matches. The content of the first match was decided by the male lead, and he quickly thought of having a water volleyball match. Upon hearing the rules, everyone was astonished. No one had ever heard of this way of playing before. The male lead side, represented by Paramera and the personal maid, competes against the Mermaid King and his daughter. Given the mermaid's clear advantage in water events, the father and daughter quickly score the first point. The next event is decided by the Mermaid King. The chief plans a swimming relay race with teams of 2. The male lead finally feels the pressure. If he loses again, he will really have to marry Priora. The male lead side sent out Kamsin and the deputy leader for the relay. Although Kamsin swam very hard in the first leg and was about to catch up with Priora, the opponent suddenly dove underwater to accelerate and completed the baton exchange with her partner first. The deputy leader pursued vigorously from behind. The score was finally tied, and the Mermaid King didn't expect to lose points in his area of expertise. He let the male lead decide the final competition event, and he chose a shaved ice eating contest. The competition was still a 2-person team battle. This time, the male lead decided to participate himself. Seeing this, Artie volunteered. As soon as the competition started, all 4 of them got brain freeze from the shaved ice. Seeing that Artie was still enduring the discomfort and continuing to eat, the male lead decided to go all out. The four of them seemed to speed up, and the shaved ice in their bowls visibly decreased. The male lead's side finished first, thinking that this would put an end to his marriage with Priora. However, unexpectedly, the Mermaid King became even more fond of the male lead, believing that only he was worthy of his daughter. The male protagonist took only 2 weeks to build star-shaped walls on the outskirts of the territory, and equipped them all with upgraded crossbows capable of double shots. The power of a single arrow could even rival the most destructive fire magic, and the male protagonist equipped a total of 100 of these powerful crossbows. Panamera was extremely envious, and hoped to purchase one at a high price. The male lead first refused by saying that strategic weapons were not for sale. After keeping him in suspense, he agreed to let Panamera have one in exchange for a favor. Kamshin then followed up by promoting the crossbow bolts produced by the male lead, stating that the power of the crossbow depended entirely on them. He then personally demonstrated by easily slicing through Panamera's sword with the iron arrows produced by the male lead, as if cutting through tofu. Seeing this, Panamera indeed took the bait and ordered a large batch of crossbow bolts. This was the protagonist's ultimate goal, as in weapon trading, ammunition is actually the main source of profit. Once he earns enough money, he can produce weapons even stronger than crossbows. Unfortunately, the period of stable development is always short. An adult green dragon suddenly appeared and is charging towards the protagonist's territory. Fortunately, the Green Forest Dragon is only a mid-tier dragon and does not have a wide-range destructive breath. The protagonist, with over 100 ballistae, is fully capable of fighting it. Unexpectedly, although the Green Dragon is large, it is much more agile than the armored sub-dragon, making it not so easy to aim at. Seeing this, Panamera took on the task of distraction. He achieved the leap from commoner to noble through military achievements, naturally possessing the powerful strength to match. A single rock spear directly blasted the Green Dragon to the ground. Unfortunately, despite the impressive momentum, it did not cause any harm to the Green Dragon. However, this successfully delayed the dragon's actions, creating an opportunity for the crossbows to fire in unison. Although this volley still failed to hit the torso, it successfully pierced the Green Dragon's wing, forcing it to land on the ground and choose to glide at low altitude to prevent the injury from worsening. Seeing that the Green Dragon was already close to the outer wall, Panamera immediately continued using fire magic. Even if it couldn't cause much damage, it could effectively hinder the Green Dragon's advance, buying time for the residents of the outer wall to retreat to the inner wall. Although the Green Dragon's magic resistance was strong, it couldn't withstand the continuous output of flames. By the time it finally climbed onto the outer wall, its wings had been burned down to just the skeleton. At this moment, the butler calmly stepped forward. Although he couldn't take on the Green Dragon alone, he was a powerful 4-element mage, and delaying the dragon's actions a bit was easy for him. Although real men never look back at explosions, seeing the butler's slow pace, the protagonist couldn't help but urge him to at least run a bit, as this was not the time to worry about elegance. Thanks to the butler's delay, the inner city's ballistae are all ready, poised to meet the Green Dragon's attack. The Knights group took on the task of distraction. With the weapons crafted by the protagonist in hand, holding out for a while is not a problem. The butler is also not idle, providing support from the rear with earth magic at any time. Coordinate with the Knights to lure the Green Dragon into optimal range. Panamera seized the opportunity to strike together, unleashing her most powerful magic, Flame Burst, pinning the Green Dragon in place, unable to move. With the protagonist's command, over 100 ballistae launched a volley. Trapped in the flames, the Green Dragon instantly became a target, mercilessly pierced by countless bolts. When the flames gradually dissipated, the Green Dragon's body had been shot full of holes and lay motionless on the ground. However, when the deputy commander approached, the Green Dragon suddenly opened its eyes and launched a final desperate struggle against him. Seeing this, the deputy commander decisively raised his greatsword and swung it down, beheading the Green Dragon in one stroke, and luckily achieved the feat of slaying a dragon. All the residents cheered in unison, celebrating this hard-won victory. After all, an adult dragon is capable of destroying a city. Yet the protagonist not only led everyone to a successful hunt, but also achieved it without any casualties, with the only cost being 2 ballistae. Panamera had her worldview changed by the protagonist's ballista, not expecting it to be strong enough to pierce dragon scales, and yet the protagonist was still researching how to make it even stronger. Panamera rose from the bottom, enduring trials worse than death, and step by step, starting as a knight, she earned the Emperor's recognition through her achievements, and successfully obtained the title of Viscount. Therefore, she is well aware of how the protagonist's production magic will impact the existing combat system. Thus, in addition to holding a commendation ceremony for the protagonist and his subordinates in her capacity as a Viscount, she also publicly announced the establishment of an alliance with the protagonist. The male protagonist was expelled by his marquis father and severely lacked connections in the noble circle, so he naturally had no reason to refuse such a mutually beneficial offer, and readily agreed. Normally, the materials produced by an adult dragon would be worth at least 100 white gold coins, which converts to 10 billion yen. However, the people from the Merry Chamber of Commerce were not honest, and only offered a mere 60 coins. In any case, in such remote areas, apart from the Merry Chamber of Commerce, no one else can handle this batch of materials, so they are not afraid that the protagonist won't sell. However, the Bell brothers are unwilling to do this. They have witnessed the protagonist's rise and believe he will go much further in the future. In their view, offending the protagonist over a few dozen white gold coins is not worth it, so even at the risk of being expelled from the guild, they are unwilling to join the guild in exploiting the protagonist. The protagonist believes it's better to rely on oneself than others and suggests that the two should start their own business, with his support to establish a new guild. Establishing a guild requires meeting 3 conditions, and for the protagonist, the funds and shop are not an issue. As for the third requirement of a noble sponsor, the protagonist chose his new ally, Panamera. Panamera is a newly risen noble, currently without any followers or even a territory. By becoming the sponsor for the new business association, she can receive a considerable share, enough for her to recruit soldiers. With the protagonist coordinating, there's no need to worry about trust issues, making it an ideal situation for her. Seeing her agree so readily, the protagonist even considered giving her the credit for defeating the Green Dragon, allowing him to continue developing quietly. Panamera immediately refused, and, just like the male lead suggested to the Bell brothers, suggested that the male lead establish his own domain, and use the achievement of slaying the dragon to earn a title. This way, he wouldn't have to worry about his marquis father forcibly reclaiming the territory upon learning of this. Panamera actually does not agree with the male lead's cautious approach. The fame of slaying a dragon not only brings enemies, but also friends, and it has an unparalleled deterrent effect on petty criminals. If anyone truly dares to invade, then raise the butcher's knife without hesitation. As long as heads roll, naturally, no one will dare to provoke the protagonist. The people from the Merry Chamber of Commerce left without even saying goodbye, fully believing that the protagonist would definitely come to beg them. However, they didn't expect Panamera to personally lead the way, taking the Bell brothers with her and leaving them in the dust. Only then did the 2 merchants realize that they had already gathered the conditions to establish a new Chamber of Commerce, meaning the Merry Chamber of Commerce was no longer useful to the protagonist. Panamera wasted no time and quickly went to the capital to meet the king, recommending the protagonist to become a noble. Panamera was personally promoted by the king, and the king had never seen her praise someone so highly, which piqued his interest in the protagonist. However, the male protagonist's experiences are too unbelievable. Not only is he only 8 years old, but he also awakened a production magic considered useless. Yet, in a short time, he transformed a barren village into an impregnable fortress, and even slew an adult green dragon. If it weren't for the fact that it was Panamera, known for her rigor, on the other side, the king would definitely think the battle achievements were exaggerated. Panamera, however, remained calm and directly presented the dragon tooth she brought as proof, seriously suggesting to the king that he must see the protagonist's territory with his own eyes. Then the king would understand that the protagonist is definitely a strategic level weapon for the entire kingdom. During the time Panamera was away, the protagonist beautified and renovated the houses in the village, and improved the overall layout until everything was neatly arranged. Outside the city, he also constructed 2 tall towers, which would help in spotting distant enemies in time. And as a production-type lord, how could he not build wonders? The protagonist's village was developing better and better, while the taxes and labor duties in the neighboring count's territory were extremely heavy, causing refugees to flee to the protagonist's side seeking to join. In principle, the protagonist and the count belonged to the same kingdom, so accepting the other's refugees was somewhat improper. However, on one hand, the refugees risked their lives to come, and the protagonist really couldn't bring himself to drive them away. On the other hand, the territory was indeed lacking in population, so he agreed to take in the refugees. Initially, he thought there were only the 10 people in front of him, but unexpectedly, there were nearly 300 more behind them, which was 3 times the population of the protagonist's territory. They also brought along many livestock, which could potentially allow the protagonist to develop animal husbandry. The male lead instantly set aside his principles, not only promising to allocate a house to each family, but also dispatching mercenaries to escort the subsequent large group. After all, with this population, the village's development speed could definitely increase several times. In fact, not all refugees were willing to move. Their village was already remote enough, and the male lead's village was directly on the border, unimaginably barren. However, when the refugees successfully arrived, they found this place to be like paradise. The roasted meat, which they couldn't even have once a year, was provided here in unlimited quantities for free, and there was even a promise of housing. Because the benefits offered by the protagonist were so good, the refugees all hoped to start working immediately, otherwise, they felt uneasy. The protagonist, however, directly stated to have a meal first and then dessert. As for the work, there will definitely be plenty in the future. The protagonist originally didn't plan to open the hidden dungeon so early, but since a large number of refugees were just taken in, the stored supplies are somewhat insufficient. It is necessary to rely on the dungeon, which has virtually unlimited resources, to supplement them. Now the immediate task is to report the dungeon matter to the king, so that the process is flawless. Due to the tight schedule, the task fell on the scout Kusala. Alt and his companions were initially a bit gloating, as the journey to the capital was time-consuming and laborious. But the protagonist never lets those who work for him suffer a loss. In return, he instantly created a mithril dagger, which made everyone else insanely jealous. Unexpectedly, there was even more to be envious of. With this mithril dagger from the protagonist, Kusala managed to defeat 3 orcs near the capital, whom he would have otherwise fled from without hesitation. He also won the favor of the fallen noblewoman Milia, abandoning his original plan to seek a living in the capital, and followed Kusala back to the protagonist's territory. If it had stopped there, Alt could barely hold it together, but the protagonist immediately added to it by deciding to build Kusala a new house, proving that honest work pays off, which instantly broke Alt's defenses, making him cry out loud. The opening of the new dungeon would inevitably attract many adventurers to the village, so to prevent them from disrupting the existing order, the protagonist began constructing an adventurer town in the outer city. For others, it might be time-consuming and labor-intensive, but for the protagonist, as long as the villagers handle transporting the materials, building a small town is just a matter of minutes. At this moment, a group of flamboyant individuals rushed over from afar. The protagonist initially thought they were clueless thieves rushing to their doom, but it turned out they just looked fierce and were actually a group of warm-hearted adventurers. Upon learning that a new dungeon was about to open here, they all came running. The adventurers, seeing the towering city walls behind the protagonist, were shocked and asked if this wasn't a rundown little village. So the protagonist took the opportunity to show off, raising his hand to instantly create the framework of the adventurers' town, startling the adventurers into exclaiming that the little guy in front of them was the legendary dragon-slaying lord. The deputy leader, upon hearing this, was instantly filled with anger and demanded to know who dared to disrespect his lord. At first, the adventurers didn't take it seriously, but the deputy leader, using the power of his weapon, effortlessly broke all their swords, instantly subduing the group of adventurers. Conquering a dungeon is a very tough task, as various monsters always emerge from the dungeon entrance, making it impossible to establish a decent base. Therefore, Poulier hopes the protagonist can help with this task. Even though Poulier attacked the protagonist's weak spot and used charm on this 8-year-old child, the protagonist remained unmoved, stating that unless the adventurers escort him all the way, he would only be responsible for building the stronghold. Thinking this condition was harsh enough, Poulier happily agreed. The adventurers kept their promise, staying by the protagonist's side at all times, ensuring that no monsters on the road could even get close to him. Even though it was clearly a dangerous pioneering journey, for the protagonist, it felt more like a family outing. However, there was one thing that made the protagonist very dissatisfied: the seemingly dangerous single-plank bridge, where the adventurers recklessly performed tricks. To the protagonist, a genuine civil engineer, it was as if they completely disregarded safety regulations. So he immediately stopped the excited crowd, demanded they all kneel and reflect, recite the safety guidelines 100 times, and then created a sturdy arch bridge on the spot. Only then did he lead everyone across the cliff. For the dungeon entrance where monsters always appear, the protagonist created a steel gate, which even the city-destroying green forest dragon would take at least a whole day to break through. Then he ordered the adventurers to bring materials and created a perfect base for them, with the same safety standards, covering all necessary functions. On the roof, he made a rainwater storage system, which, although not drinkable, was more than sufficient for cleaning and washing. The adventurers had never enjoyed such a good environment before, and they kept popping their heads out like moles, looking ready to settle down there. Subsequently, the large sum obtained from auctioning the dragon materials was casually handed over to the maid for safekeeping. However, he was overjoyed with the mechanical crossbow capable of 10 consecutive shots sent by the Bell brothers. After all, once the principle of 10 consecutive shots is understood and applied to the ballista, who knows how much more powerful the already dragon-hunting capable ballista would become. The protagonist was curious about what magic Aldi had awakened, but Aldi appeared very uneasy. He awakened to puppet magic. Puppet magic cannot be said to be useless. On the contrary, it can kill invisibly, but precisely because of this, it is regarded as a taboo magic by the nobles. However, the protagonist does not have such prejudice, so he produced a mithril puppet for him and encouraged him to perform in front of the villagers. Some villagers realized it was puppet magic and immediately started whispering, as many rebels have been users of this magic. The protagonist, however, does not care about this. Aldi was initially a bit timid, but with the protagonist's support, he mustered the courage to use the puppet magic that had long become instinctual. In an instant, the mithril puppet seemed to come to life, with none of the expected awkwardness. It performed a beautifully elegant dance on stage, mesmerizing the audience below, making them completely forget their fear and aversion. After Aldi finished his dance, the audience fell into a moment of silence, then erupted into loud cheers. This feeling of being welcomed by everyone was something Aldi had never experienced since birth. Pamela has returned and even obtained a piece of land next to the male lead's territory, saying she plans to become independent and follow the male lead. However, the male lead knows very well that this woman is not someone who would willingly submit, so there must be some trick involved. Pamela looks at the now cheerful Aldi, wanting to ask the male lead what exactly he did. But now is not the time for small talk, as the king of this kingdom, King Dino, has already arrived here. As soon as the king arrived, he conferred the title of Baron upon the protagonist, and in return, the king hoped the protagonist could show him around. The protagonist showed the king the village's defenses, focusing on the ballista on the city wall. The accompanying chancellor was knowledgeable, noting that while the ballista is suitable for dealing with large enemies, using it to hunt dragons might be a bit exaggerated. So the protagonist didn't explain further, and directly demonstrated the power of the ballista, which was capable of rapid firing. And it doesn't require a specific operator. Any ordinary person can easily operate it. The Prime Minister asked the male lead some details, and found that he could answer fluently. Even if it was unbelievable, they had to admit that this village, comparable to a military fortress, was probably indeed the work of the male lead. During the subsequent tour, the king and the Prime Minister's jaws almost never closed.
Whether it was a legendary mythical race, the mermaids who are highly wary of humans, leisurely playing and frolicking in the protagonist's territory, or the protagonist combining the butler's earth magic in just a moment to erect a high wall on the spot, both greatly overturned their worldview. As the leader of the merfolk king naturally regarded the king as the leader of the humans. Thus, as a token of friendly exchange between the two races, he sent a gift through his people. Unexpectedly, this casual gift turned out to be the mythical divine metal. With this size, if made into a sword, it could easily become a national treasure passed down through generations. Unexpectedly, during the conversation, the protagonist, feeling an itch, had already crafted the sword. After all, if he had known the merfolk had such a treasure, he wouldn't have given it to the king so easily. The king, however, was generous, and didn't intend to take such a treasure for free, promising the protagonist that he could make any request. So the protagonist revealed his true intention, which was to permanently reside in the village, and not be relocated for any reason. The king saw that the protagonist was determined, and did not choose to force him, agreeing to his request. However, in return, the protagonist also had to promise to assist when the kingdom needed help. Unexpectedly, at that moment, a bipedal dragon appeared in the sky above the territory. At first, the protagonist just thought that monsters were attacking the city, but the king and the prime minister immediately recognized it as the signature troop type of the enemy nation Yelineta, indicating that Yelinetta's army had invaded. The Yelineta side was also greatly shocked. Originally, there should have been only a small village here, but no matter how they looked at it, this was a heavily fortified military fortress. The 8th prince of the enemy country didn't believe it. It was impossible to build a fortress in such a short time. It was likely just for show. However, after hammering away with a battering ram for half a day, they found the walls were as solid as a rock. It seemed they could only rely on the wyverns to find a breakthrough from the air. But the protagonist had even slain dragons, so mere wyverns were no challenge at all. With just one crossbow shot, countless shurikens rained down like raindrops, turning the enemy's bipedal dragon into a sieve. The king and the prime minister on the city wall were full of praise. Upon hearing this sound, the 8th prince realized that the king of the Skedria kingdom was actually present in this border village, which instantly caused the Yelineta kingdom's side to lose their morale. The 8th prince was quite spineless. Even before any interrogation methods were used, he confessed everything just from being intimidated by Panamera. It turned out that Yelineta's target was not the protagonist, but Marquis Filteo, who governed the fortress city under the protagonist's father's jurisdiction. The protagonist's territory was merely attacked incidentally because it was nearby. The fortress city, as a crucial border town, concerns the safety of the entire kingdom. Therefore, the king must immediately return to the capital to organize the knights to go for rescue. However, before that, he requires the protagonist to also participate in this defense battle, to ensure the city does not fall before reinforcements arrive. The protagonist naturally was unwilling. His marquis father had exiled him, yet he was expected to risk his life to help defend the city. He wasn't that magnanimous. However, when the kingdom faced a life and death crisis, all nobles were obligated to provide assistance. It wasn't something he could refuse even if he wanted to, so he had no choice but to agree. Since it concerns the war between two countries, the protagonist is also sparing no effort. Apart from leaving the butler to look after the house, he brought all the main forces he could, even the adventurers who are not nominally under his command. The protagonist hired them at a high price for protection. After all, it concerns his own life and safety, so no amount of preparation is too much. Even someone as timid as Aldi was prepared to bring the mithril golem to fight for the protagonist's safety. The marquis was not worried upon learning that the fortress city was under attack, as it was considered impregnable, and there was no possibility of it being breached in a short time. As long as the procedure was followed and the nearby lords were asked to assist in defending the city, it would be sufficient. The new butler suddenly mentioned the protagonist, saying that he had already earned the title of Baron through his dragon-slaying achievements, which should be considered a significant support. However, the marquis scoffed at this, dismissing the idea of slaying a dragon with production magic as sheer fantasy, wondering how such an absurd rumor even came about. When the marquis led his troops to the fortress city, he discovered that the supposedly impregnable fortress city had been breached by wyverns from above. The appearance of gunpowder weapons, which almost never appear on their own, greatly shocked the marquis. Unexpectedly, the wyvern army turned and left, heading towards the west gate. This was naturally due to the protagonist's efforts. The power of the mithril golem far exceeded expectations. Even the mighty wyverns were nothing more than easy targets, taken down with a single arrow by this humanoid war machine. Neither Ardi nor the protagonist himself anticipated the mithril golem would be this strong. The enemy nation's troops continuously surged towards the protagonist, but his subordinates defended flawlessly. Even if there were a few that slipped through in the air, under the protection of the mithril golem, they couldn't advance at all. However, the protagonist decisively ordered a retreat, as risking his subordinates' lives to defend the city for his marquis father would be a pure loss even if successful. The marquis, having suffered heavy losses, naturally vented his pent-up anger on his eldest son, who arrived late after the battle. Unexpectedly, the king arrived at this moment, and he hurriedly knelt with his eldest son to greet the king. The marquis truthfully reported that the fall of the fortress city was due to a newly emerged terrifying weapon, and that the enemy army, for some unknown reason, did not pursue, but instead gathered towards the west gate. The king, however, was well aware that this must be the protagonist's doing. Seeing the marquis and Messiah's surprised expressions, the chancellor briefly confirmed that the protagonist indeed has the strength to slay a dragon, and was recently granted the title of Baron. The marquis found this hard to believe. How could someone who is not a 4-element mage accomplish such a feat?
Although the protagonist fulfilled his noble duties, considering that the enemy occupying the fortress city posed a threat to the development of his territory, he decided it should be addressed. Actively joining the battle was definitely not an option, so the protagonist decided to become an arms dealer, only responsible for supplying some powerful war weapons. As for himself, he would certainly be safely watching from the rear. For the current protagonist, there is no need to prove anything to the marquis. Even when facing the king, while all the lords are racking their brains on how to retake the fortress city, the protagonist's attitude remains relaxed. You must know, the Yelineta kingdom side, with the high mobility of their wyverns combined with the newly emerged gunpowder weapons, was as shocking as when bombers first appeared on the battlefield. The lords had no idea how to respond. The male lad alone seemed unconcerned, saying, "Why not just take out the bipedal dragon in advance?" The lords laughed. Indeed, a child is just a child. However, the king knew very well that if the protagonist said he could do it, he probably really could. So he asked the protagonist if he was willing to go to the front line to contribute to this recovery battle. Unexpectedly, the protagonist flatly refused. The lords expressed their dissatisfaction, and the marquis even reprimanded him, thinking that the protagonist's attitude was too presumptuous, as if he did not regard the lords and the king at all. The king felt reassured. Since the protagonist said so, it proved he already had a plan. The marquis still didn't trust the protagonist, but the protagonist said to just watch. Then he publicly demonstrated production magic, instantly creating a catapult and a ballista. The marquis remained skeptical, saying he had seen ballistas and catapults before, so how could they possibly deal with the wyverns? However, the king had personally witnessed how the protagonist defended the city, so he confidently announced the dismissal, letting the lords go and make their preparations for war. When Artie came to find the protagonist, she unexpectedly encountered her count father. The count felt somewhat guilty towards this less favored daughter, but with the war imminent, he still didn't say much to Artie. Now, what determines the course of the war are gunpowder and the war machines crafted by the protagonist. However, the stubborn marquis still follows the traditional method in the recapture battle, with infantry leading the charge. In contrast, the protagonist's side centers all actions around the war machines, aiming for victory by covering the ballista and catapult to reach optimal range. The defending side naturally won't let the protagonist have his way, and immediately orders archers to draw their bows and launch arrows for a long-range attack on the protagonist's side. But the protagonist's side is equipped with new style shields, which can easily block the incoming rain of arrows. Even when facing the bombardment from the mage troops, they can still hold out long enough to achieve the strategic goal of drawing attention, allowing the mage squad to reach beneath the city gate. The protagonist's side performed exceptionally well. While the marquis was struggling, they were already able to easily dominate the battlefield with their weapons. The marquis watched this unbelievable scene, and his prejudice against the protagonist quietly dissolved. Seeing the unfavorable situation, the defenders had no choice but to deploy their ultimate weapon, the dragon unit, in an attempt to turn the tide with gunpowder once more. Unexpectedly, the protagonist was waiting for this moment. With a new command from Cam, the eager catapults launched simultaneously, and as the ammunition reached midair, it scattered like a celestial maiden scattering flowers, unleashing countless fragments that rained down the wyverns like raindrops. Unfortunately, under this saturation attack, one wyvern survived. However, since the protagonist's side had already slain dragons, a mere wyvern was no challenge, and in no time, it was shot full of holes. Seeing that the battle was nearing its end, Panamera no longer conserved her magic power and casually cast a high-level fire spell, with the deputy commander following up to finish off the enemy. The death of the last wyvern meant that the main force of the enemy army was completely annihilated. The kingdom's side won this recapture battle. After the battle, the marquis turned and left. Although he now had a newfound respect for the protagonist, as a father, it was still somewhat embarrassing to bow to his son, so he decided it was better not to meet at all. After interrogating the enemy commander, the protagonist received some troubling news. Besides the fortress city, Yelinator is also planning to attack another location, which is the territory of Artie's father, Count Ferdinand. In fact, if the protagonist joins the battle, there is no need for Artie to go to the battlefield. However, if outsiders intervene, it implies that Artie's father, the Count, is incompetent and unable to defend his territory, which would inevitably lead to his demotion. Therefore, Artie changed her usual timid demeanor, hoping that the protagonist's people would only provide support, and that she, the daughter of the Count, must be the one truly responsible for repelling the enemy. The mithril golem shocked the enemy as soon as it entered the battlefield. Although the wyverns are not as formidable as true dragons, they are still top-tier magical creatures, and now they were being slaughtered as easily as chickens by a silver knight, completely overturning their worldview. Realizing that the controller of the Silver Knight was actually Artie from afar, countless enemies swarmed over, but the protagonist's people were there for this purpose, ensuring Artie's safety, and no one could breach their defense. Artie didn't need to worry about her safety, she just needed to focus on controlling the puppet to kill the enemies. However, since everyone was sent by the protagonist to help her, Artie naturally didn't want them to get hurt, so she constantly spared some attention to protect everyone. Although this inevitably led to some oversight, causing the puppet to suffer heavy damage and lose an arm, it did not affect the puppet's strength at all, and it was still able to easily suppress the enemy forces. After a fierce battle, with the mithril puppet paying the price of being covered in wounds, Artie finally managed to clear an area. Unexpectedly, the main force of the enemy, a large army of flying dragons, gathered together. The army of bipedal dragons is Yelinitar's ace force, and now they are collectively targeting the mithril golem to eliminate this sole variable. Unexpectedly, after sacrificing many dragon lives and just as they were about to destroy the mithril golem, a pink golem appeared. It turns out that the protagonist had given Artie more than one golem from the start, but with Artie's current magical power, she is not yet able to control 2 golems for an extended period. Moreover, with the sheer number of wyverns, prolonged battles inevitably lead to casualties. Therefore, Artie unleashed full firepower right from the start, slaughtering within the wyvern army. Artie once felt ashamed of her puppet magic, as using such sinister and bizarre magic was considered disgraceful among the nobility. It wasn't until the protagonist crafted the mithril puppet for her that Artie truly realized her puppet magic could indeed change the course of war. With the coordinated attack of the 2 puppets, the seemingly endless army of flying dragons was halved in an instant. The enemy commander was truly anxious, as the flying dragon forces suffered heavy losses. In the end, even if she won, she couldn't escape the fate of being held accountable. Only by killing this white-haired girl with all her might could she atone for her sins. However, with continuous battles, Artie's proficiency in controlling puppets increased, and she no longer felt nervous about such things, instead continuing to focus on controlling the puppets until the last flying dragon was slain. Seeing that the kingdom's ace troops were completely slaughtered by a young girl, the morale on Yelinetta's side utterly collapsed, and they fled the battlefield as if running for their lives. The protagonist's side immediately cheered in unison, celebrating the epic victory brought by Artie. However, Artie knew very well that without the mithril puppet crafted by the protagonist, she couldn't have accomplished this on her own. Artie's mother and sister had originally prepared to commit suicide, preferring death over being humiliated by the enemy forces. Unexpectedly, not long after, the sounds of battle ceased, as if someone had saved them. The Count brought news from the battlefield, saying that the reinforcements were 2 puppets controlled by a white-haired girl. This combination indicated that the reinforcements were brought by Artie. After sending Artie for an arranged marriage, Artie's mother often mistook her eldest daughter for Artie, and now she felt a deep sense of guilt. Unexpectedly, this least-favored youngest daughter would come to rescue everyone without holding grudges. Amidst the ruins, Artie gazed at the mansion where she grew up, but ultimately chose not to reunite with her family. After all, some things, once they happen, cannot be easily undone. Now the male lead is her true home. Although Artie was formidable on the battlefield, she still lacks confidence when facing the male lead. However, the male lead is very good at providing emotional support, saying that if single-handedly suppressing an entire army isn't something to be proud of, then nothing is. Instantly, a glimmer appeared in Artie's eyes, and with a complex mix of emotions, she shed tears, as if wanting to pour out all the grievances she has suffered in her family along with her tears. I'm back. As time passed, the male lead transformed the village significantly, bringing it closer to modernization. People of different cultures and races live here peacefully and harmoniously. The once dilapidated and backward village is now unrecognizable. Only the butler and the deputy leader remain unchanged in their intentions. One wants to train the male lead to become a great scholar, while the other aims to make him the kingdom's top swordsman.
However, the male lead doesn't want to choose either. After all, why go through the hard work of training and studying when you can enjoy life while developing things?